Sometimes we get asked by listeners, can you please make your podcast based on trimesters or in chronological order of a pregnancy? Which I am sorry, after a few years in of publishing our podcast, the horses bolted on that one a bit. So we got to thinking, what else can we do to make it easier for our listeners? We have a solution. Pat and I have written a week-by-week newsletter which follows along your pregnancy and gives you tips and links to the relevant podcast and other value content we have published. Best of all, it's free and you can sign up with your due date at growmybaby.com.au at any stage of your pregnancy.
The information in this podcast is provided for education and research information only. It is not a substitute for professional health advice.
If you're trying to get pregnant or you are pregnant and you feel a little bit overwhelmed by all you need to know, then this is the right podcast for you. Welcome to the show. I'm Brigid Maloney.
And I'm obstetrician Dr. Patrick Maloney. And this is The Kick, your expert-led podcast that delivers the essentials of growing a baby. Make sure you head to our website, growmybaby.com.au, to get some awesome free tools like our pregnancy knowledge checker to help you feel like you got this.
Welcome everyone, I'm Brigid Maloney, and today on The Kick I'm interviewing Associate Professor Michelle Jongenelis, who is a clinical psychologist, and she's done some research around grandparenting. Now, grandparenting is fascinating for me, and I think this might be just the start of maybe a series that we need to do about grandparenting, because the values that your grandparents have in terms of things such as your pregnancy, looking after your newborn, or even grandparenting your kids in a formal sort of childcare setting afterwards, is it going to be a big part of your life? And I think it's a really important topic for us to explore. So today, Michelle is going to talk about some research she did about formalised childcare that grandparents provide, because the stats are significant. At least 20% of kids are looked after by their grandparents, and that forms quite a big part of how that child is reared. So let's get into it. Welcome, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I would just like to start by perhaps if you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor at the University of Melbourne and deputy director of our Centre for Behaviour Change. So I started working in sort of health promotion, public health, about 10 years ago. My PhD was actually in sort of clinical psychology. So I'm a clinical psychologist by trade, but fell in love with public health and health promotion more at the population level, and started working with Cancer Council Western Australia to look at, basically what are cancer risk factors and how can we help people reduce their cancer risk. So as part of that, we looked at things like obviously tobacco control and alcohol and physical activity, nutrition, sun protection. So basically any cancer risk factor, we were interested in looking at how do we reduce people's risk. So I've continued that work now that I'm based in Melbourne, working still with cancer councils, around Australia to sort of how do we improve people's health and basically get people living the best life they can live.
And how did that lead you into researching grandparents?
Well, what we started realising was that there was a lot of focus on, parents, obviously. They spend a lot of time with their kids. And what we found out, though, was that cost of living is increasing. Childcare is becoming really unaffordable. It's also not that flexible. Like you have to pick up your kid at a certain time. What we were hearing was that grandparents were filling a big gap in sort of feeding children, potentially, engaging in physical activity with them. And we sort of saw this as a missed opportunity. Like if we want to have kids developing really good habits that we know lead into adulthood, then who are their care providers? Parents, but also grandparents. And so when we talk about reducing cancer risk factors, grandparents are actually really important there as well, not just parents.
I'd like to explore that a little bit more in terms of it's not just the ad hoc times that grandparents are having involvement in their grandkids' lives. It's scheduled, consistent involvement, isn't it? So what are the stats around that?
Yeah, so the latest stats suggest that 20% of children are usually or always being cared for by their grandparents when their parents are working. So that's a considerable number of Australia's kids. This isn't just, can you look after them for a couple of hours on the weekend while we do a date night? This is often parents dropping the kids off, before school because they have to get to work early, grandparents picking the kids up after school and often having them until dinner time or even after dinner time while parents, are working late. So this really is a secondary, what we would call secondary care, not that ad hoc care, which, of course is still important. But if you're providing that much care, then you really do need to make sure that the kids are eating well, especially if you're providing most of their meals, for example.
Yeah, and there's some really tricky points to that relationship, aren't there? So there's not only the relationship between the grandparent and the grandchild, because that starts to be that they have to be a disciplinarian or, set boundaries, but it's also that tricky time between the grandparent and parent. How do they communicate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Did your research go into that at all?
Yeah, we did find, particularly with a focus group. So this is something that previous research has sort of suggested as well, mainly in a focus group context where we can get this really interesting data come out. It's sort of hard to ask a, five scale question on, how do you get along with the grandparents? In focus groups in previous research, there has been sort of this tension between parents and grandparents. And we also found that in our focus group as well, this sort of idea, obviously we only had the grandparents' point of view because we didn't look at parents in our research, but the grandparents were certainly saying things like, when it came to screen time or physical activity, they were saying, the parents drop the kids off with iPads in their hands and I don't like that. So what am I meant to do? But then when you look at the research that's been done on parents by other researchers, the parents are often saying, I'll pick the kids up and they will have had just sugar all afternoon. So there is a bit of a discrepancy in reports there, but I think that communication is going to be really important moving forward. Is everyone on the same page? Because often, and another thing that came up in our research, is the kids are using this lack of communication to their advantage. So they're saying to the grandparent, well, mum lets me do this at home. And the grandparent goes, oh, okay, if you're allowed to do it at home, then I won't get in trouble. And then they find out, actually, no, they're not allowed to do it at home and they've been completely played. So communication really important there.
And it's very tricky. I have got a mother. She's very dominant. And for me, if she ever did, I was very lucky. She did look after my two oldest boys for about nearly 6 months when I was a single mum. And she looked after them for 2 days while I worked full time and I had care for the other 3 days. But I had no say and I had to accept that. I had to say to myself, okay, mum is looking after the kids. There was a financial arrangement because I don't believe that grandparents should do this stuff for free. So there was a financial arrangement, but I knew that the minute mum walked in the door, I was no longer the person who could have any parental say. And I just had to suck that up. I know you didn't do the parent side, but did the grandparents, how did that come across in the research?
Some grandparents often, again, in the focus groups would report sort of saying things like, if the kids are at my house and it's my house, my rules, especially when it came to screen time. So it didn't really come up that much with nutrition, but certainly with screen time, the grandparents were saying, found it easier to come up with rules around that and saying, it's my house, my rules, there's, no internet or there's no phones or whatever it is. But certainly you raise an interesting point around grandparent care in that parents are often so reliant on it that they might be reluctant to bring up issues for fear of losing that important care arrangement. So it's often not just sort of the grandparents needing to talk to the parents, but the parents often potentially needing support to talk to the grandparents in a way that doesn't risk that relationship rupturing.
Because childcare isn't flexible, you then think, if I lose that grandparent, then I'm actually stuffed.
Yeah, exactly.
What do I do,
Yeah.
One thing I want to explore, did the grandparents talk at all about the backup that they might be for when their child is sick and can't go to a formal childcare setting?
No.
I'm thinking a lot of these grandparents are ageing, and if they've got their vulnerable population as well, and so all of a sudden they've got this sick kid that's come home, they're likely to get a cold or COVID or whatever. It's a tricky sort of scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think because the questions we asked were very specifically directed around nutrition and physical activity, the general issues that might come up as a result of childcare in general, so what happens when you're suddenly lumped with a sick kid, that didn't really come up. The only time COVID kind of came up was, the nutrition work we did pre-COVID. It was the physical activity, that stuff that we did sort of during COVID, post-COVID. And it was actually, it didn't come up a lot, but some grandparents said that it was actually the kids who were often fearful of going out and engaging in physical activity because of COVID. And there were some grandparents that said that they hadn't had a chance to see their grandkids in quite some time, or at least during the COVID years. In terms of grandparents talking about whether they were annoyed or anything about sort of being sick, that didn't come up. But like I said, we asked very specifically around nutrition and physical activity.
All right, well, let's talk about nutrition, because when I then married Dr. Pat, we had different nutrition ideas. I've come from a quite a rural background, and it was the meat and 3 veg and very food from its natural source. So I feel like I've had a really great upbringing in terms of what good food means. And so I was very happy that my mum took over the nutrition of the kids, because it was exactly how I was raised.
Yeah.
However, Pat's mum, she introduced Coca-Cola. The kids hadn't had Coke. She loves giving the kids lollies, and I mean copious amounts of lollies. It's not just like 1 or 2 snakes. It's like the big family font size bag of snakes. Yeah. What happens there? It's when you've got 2 different sets of values, or your values differ from what the grandparents are giving, or the grandparents just want to be good time granny, which I get.
Yeah, and this is where the communication comes up as important. And certainly in our research and in previous research, they have talked about this idea of food is often a way that people show their love. And I think there was a quote from one of our grandparents who was like, well, if the kids are coming over to my house, I don't want to be that witch that tells them what they can and cannot eat. So there's a sort of a balance for grandparents of wanting to show that they love the kids through providing lollies or whatever it happens to be, but also needing to be mindful of, well, actually, loving this child means giving them the best possible, start in life. So I think it's all about the communication, but also the moderation. Like you can give them a lolly, but it needs to be just one lolly. It can't be the bag of lollies. And so, yeah, there's definitely a tension there. And certainly, that came up with the grandparents saying that they didn't necessarily agree with the way that the parents were feeding the kids. We had quite a few grandparents who sort of said, it feels like every time I go over there, they're eating takeout because mum and dad have come home late from work and no one's been able to cook. And so often grandparents were also doing this sort of balance of, yes, I might provide them with lollies, but at least for their main meals, they are getting a home-cooked meal as opposed to the takeout that they're getting with mum and dad. So it really is sort of this complex balancing act that grandparents engage in, and parents might often think, they're getting lollies all the time, but are they then getting a home-cooked meal? So it's a really tricky situation to navigate.
So, Michelle, what about the families that might have 2 sets of grandparents involved in that grandchild's care, and they have very different views, either because, of cultural differences, or they just have different values? And was there a preference to the mother's parents or the father's parents?
No, but again, I think we didn't specifically ask about that. There were a couple of instances where the grandparent that was in our focus group did mention the other grandparent and their grandparenting style. But I think we were lucky in that because we were recruiting grandparents who provided at least 3 hours of care, we sort of recruited the primary grandparent caregiver, if that makes sense. So the other grandparent was likely not as involved in things, but I can think of maybe 2 instances where the grandparent we were talking to was complaining about the food practices of the other grandparent, but we didn't specifically ask about that. But it's a great point, because I think you're absolutely right. I think there usually is a preference for the mother's mother in all of this, and then culture would of course play a really interesting role too.
And did the grandparents tell you how they like to be communicated with?
No, they didn't. We did ask them for the nutrition side of stuff. If we were to sort of develop a nutrition resource, what would that look like? What would you like it to look like? And seminars came up as being particularly desired. Yeah. So they do obviously still want the stuff online and the fact sheets and the brochures, fridge magnets, but they actually also said that seminars would be good because it gives them an opportunity to interact with others. And they really loved the focus groups because they got a chance to have a chat and just see what other grandparents are doing to help them out. And so what we sort of suggested in our research was we shouldn't just target these seminars to grandparents. We should be targeting to families in general. And then you do start to open up that sort of lines of discussion where grandparents and parents, aunts, uncles are all getting exposed to the same information, as opposed to a parent saying, well, I've read this, and then a grandparent saying, well, I've read this, and then it's conflicting. Whereas if they're both attending the same seminar and getting the same information, then they can say to each other, well, this seminar we went to said this, how about we give that a go?
Yeah.
So seminars, I think, certainly was something for, in terms of dealing with families.
I think that would be a great idea. And we do have lots of dietitians that listen to our podcast. And so if any dietitians out there listening, there we go. There's a business idea for you.
Yeah.
I think that would be really great because, as I said, I had no say in what either grandma has given our kids over the time. But I'm sure that there's other grandparents that said, my kids are so prescriptive of what I must do that I have no agency.
Yeah.
Did that come across too?
It came up a few times, not a lot. And it's sort of hard. I'm just thinking back to how that was perceived. Some grandparents, I think, really liked it because it took the mental load out of what do I feed this kid or what do I do in terms of physical activity. Whereas others, did comment about, well, I don't want to be so prescriptive because they're coming to granny's house and I want to be fun granny. So I think there's sort of I think it depends on the grandparent with what they want and what other stuff they've got going on in their lives. So, if they are having to attend all these medical appointments, then all of a sudden there's a kid there, maybe they do prefer just to be told this is what they eat at this time and here is all the food for them and you don't have to worry about any of the cooking. So I'm sort of harping on about this, but again, it's the communication between the parents and the grandparents. How do you want this care arrangement to look? And having that conversation before the care arrangement starts, as opposed to waiting for this conflict or potential discrepancy to appear and then trying to resolve it. I think setting the expectations early is really important.
I want to move on to screen time because it is, oh my God, it's hard enough for a parent, let alone a grandparent who might be new to all of this, and they might think, well, maybe that is the social norm for that kid to sit on a screen all day. Am I old-fashioned in my approach to parenting? What were some of the things that they talked about in terms of screen time?
A couple of things. I think broadly they recognised that screen time was not a good thing to be doing. There was exactly what you've just noted around a concern that, particularly with older kids who use screens to communicate with others. So yeah, there was a concern that grandparents, that they were stopping their grandkids potentially from engaging socially, and then they'd be missing out on things and they might not develop well in terms of their socializing skills. So that was something that came up, but mainly for grandparents of older grandkids who had mobile phones and where communication typically takes place over, text message or Snapchat or whatever they're using these days. So there was that. Grandparents were also, similar to parents, admitted to using screen time as a sort of babysitting respite tool. So they were often saying, if I've been running around after the kids all day and I just need an hour to cook dinner or to prep or to just relax, then yeah, we will put them in front of a screen. So we're really conscious then of not being, in terms of our recommendations, not being too prescriptive and sort of saying, there are adaptive forms of screen time or adaptive forms of quiet time as well. So, we talk about sedentary behaviour being a bad thing, and as long as they're being more active than not, then that's good. And as long as the sedentary behaviour that they're engaging in is positive. So things like reading books or doing puzzles or doing some activities, or if you do need to use screens, there are lots of educational apps or even stuff on YouTube that actually encourages the kids to get active. So being a little bit more, rather than saying all screen time is bad, being a bit more judicious in the screen time that you do provide. So that was something that came up. But like I said, broadly, they all knew that screen time wasn't the best thing and that it was important for kids to be active.
For the kids that are sent to their grandparents with a screen, and, I've seen that in our own families, in our cousins, and, there are some that will take, even very young, take a screen to their cot or to their bed, or that must be so tricky for a grandparent to navigate. I mean, it's tricky for a parent to navigate. What sort of boundaries can grandparents put around those things?
Well, some grandparents wanted to sort of have a discussion with the parent around, don't bring those devices over. And some grandparents had those conversations successfully. I think that because it sets a norm, right? Like if the parent is coming over and the kid has an iPad, then the expectation has been set with the child and with the grandparent that this is allowed and this is okay. So I think the key though there is to make sure that you're sending them with something. So if it's not an iPad because the grandparent, doesn't like that, can you send them over with something like a scooter or a bat or a ball? Because we also sort of need to realise that grandparents might not have this portable play equipment. And our research found that, and other research has found that having that equipment around the home results in kids being more active because it's there, it's accessible, and it's easy for them to do. So if you're sending a child to their grandparents with an iPad, replace that iPad with a ball. And that might then sort of send a message that actually, there's an expectation or something that you should be a bit more physically active. But yeah, again, it does require that communication in grandparents sort of saying, hey, if you bring them over with their iPad, they're just going to sit on the iPad all day. So yeah, making sure that there's some portable play equipment that gets sent is important.
It is a useful tool, but I could imagine for some kids that just will not let go of that iPad, a 3-year-old that's throwing a tantrum, whether that could be replaced with something like a bluey, a bluey on TV, which you can switch on and switch off or,
Yeah, because it can be certainly with younger kids that they do become very attached to the iPad, and then having to wean them off is tricky, and it's, really shouldn't be up to the grandparents to wean them off. It's up to both households to be sort of either limiting screen time. So that's something that we sort of suggested in our work, and that has been found in the context of nutrition to be really important is, these things, because if we label something as good or bad, then it becomes tricky. So it's, again, everything in moderation. You are allowed to use your screen, but you're allowed to use it for half an hour at this time, or you're allowed to use it to watch this show when it's on at 5 p.m.
Yeah.
Or, you're allowed to have that chocolate, but it's one chocolate every day at 2 p.m. So setting limits around it, which encourages healthy boundaries with screens and also food, as opposed to blanketly saying, no, that thing's bad. Because particularly with kids, as soon as you say no, they're just going to want it even more. It becomes this sort of forbidden fruit thing.
And then they start begging
exactly.
for it, which is also really difficult to manage. We just touched briefly on physical activity, and you said that as long as you're more physical than sedentary, what are the time splits that a parent could ask the grandparent to be mindful of?
You're listening to The Kick with Dr. Pat and Brigid.
How many times have you Googled something about your pregnancy?
When I was pregnant all the time, Dr. Pat.
Yeah. You may be confused or overwhelmed. It's normal to want information, but where's the reliable stuff from experts?
Yeah. Now, if you like our podcast, Dr. Pat and I have developed an online program to help guide you through whatever stage of pregnancy you're at.
It's taken us literally 2 years to put it together.
2 long, hard years, wasn't it?
It is a game changer in how pregnancy information is given.
Now, how it works is you get to sign up at whatever stage of pregnancy you're at. Like, so you could be pre-pregnant, in your very early stages of pregnancy, late pregnancy, preparing for birth, or maybe you've just brought your baby home, and you get lots of information around that.
We've called in all our contacts too, so we've got a dietitian, anaesthetist, physiotherapist.
Sonographer.
Yeah, who else? Paediatric nurse, obstetrician, mother of four.
Oh, just all the people you need to hear from.
So if that's you, come and join us at www.growmybaby.com.au.
I mean, I guess it depends on how long the grandparents have them for. It would also depend on, the health and mobility challenges that the grandparent might have. Oh, there are so many factors. The residential location of the grandparent as well. So if grandparents have downsized and they're living in an apartment complex and they don't have ready access to backyards and front yards, then it might be a little bit trickier to do that. So there aren't sort of any specific numbers, but I guess keeping that as long as they're moving their body more than they're not moving their body, that tends to be the typical sort of rule that I follow. Because, there are a lot of factors and the built environment did come up as being important as well in our research. Just a lot of grandparents sort of saying, well, outdoor play and playing in the backyard or the front yard was, really important. So a lot of grandparents did that. So if you're a grandparent who doesn't have a backyard or front yard, then where are the kids going to play? And that's where the built environment comes in. Do you have a park that's close by? And we know that there are a lot of suburbs out there that don't have access to green space. Our urban environment isn't that great. So then if there's no park and there's no backyard and front yard, what are these children going to do? So I think there was a lesson there as well in terms of policy to make sure that we have a built environment that encourages movement. So like I said, there's no sort of fixed numbers, but as long as they're moving their body more than they're not. And if they do live in an environment that sort of isn't very conducive to physical activity, then this might be where that adaptive screen time comes in. Those YouTube videos where, kids have to like duck and weave to make sure they don't get hit by a bomb that's coming at them on the screen. Like that might be the way of sort of trying to integrate some movement.
Yeah, the grandparents' own mobility and perhaps even constraints, if there was a planned activity that they needed to get their child to, I mean, they all are considerations as well, aren't they? If they can drive. Yeah, so
I think it was the top actually. Well, the top two sort of barriers to physical activity. The number one was sort of the logistics of it, the cost, the organising. So, I think you mentioned earlier finances and I think it's important that sort of grandparents are compensated to engage in these activities and for doing this labour. But the cost came up as important. They were sort of saying, if I have to take the kids to the pool and the entrance fee to the pool is this amount of money. And then on top of that, if they're caring for multiple kids, they'll often say, well, the beach is free, but then I have to get 3 kids into the car, I need to carry towels, I need to carry snacks. Like it just becomes a lot logistically. So that came up as sort of number one, just, the effort that comes with getting kids to be active. And then related to that was the mobility, and it was mainly came up in the context of safety. So older adults or grandparents were kind of saying, I do want to take the kid to the park, but if the park doesn't have a fence around it, and the 4-year-old suddenly takes off, I don't have it in me anymore to run after them. And so I'd much rather not go to the park because I don't want anything to happen to them. So that mobility, or just not being as fast as a 4-year-old sometimes, came up as being really restrictive as well.
I think this is a great point because, we sort of maybe expect our parents to be at the same parental capability as they were when they were parents of us. Yeah. And yet, they're not. Like I'm the youngest of 6. And so by the time my mum was looking after my 2 oldest, she was mid-60s. But by the time my next set of kids, I say I've got 2 sets of kids, I've got 4 boys, the next set came along, she was in her mid-70s. The capability of her was just diminishing and I had to recognise that at every step. So, I suppose it's not taking that for granted, that what are their abilities to look after the kids. There would be no way I'd get her to drive them in a car anywhere. Only she was a safe driver, but it's getting them in the car in the first place. Like that. It was just like trying to put an octopus in a. Yeah, no, it just was a nightmare. So yeah, she didn't do any of that driving.
Yeah, no, exactly. They're kicking and screaming because they don't want to get into the back seat. And it's but you're right. It's very different for like a younger grandparent who might be in their 50s or 60s, and then you get into grandparents who are in their 70s and 80s, and it's just becomes a lot harder, even if they are got no health issues. Just it's tiring. It's tiring looking after kids.
Things have definitely changed. Like if we're just using the car example, car restraints were definitely different back in my mum's days. I think I might have sat on her knee in the car. Yeah. So I was always concerned about whether she had them buckled in properly if she did end up taking them anywhere. So, all of those things are considerations.
Well, and even for physical activity and screen time and nutrition, it's what are the rules these days?
Yeah.
But, so we, as a parent, you might be aware of it or even sort of vaguely aware of what kids should be eating and doing. And I think grandparents sort of are kind of, obviously they know that fruit and vegetables are good, sugar not so good, physical activity good, screen time not so good. But, you're right. The rules have often changed where things that were considered good are maybe not considered good anymore. And so that's something that we also need to consider is we are expecting them to also have this level of knowledge, which broadly they do. And I think actually the one thing that came up in the focus groups was they did tell us, we know what we're meant to be feeding them. We know what we're meant to be doing. We need help to actually do that. They want the hints and the tips.
Yeah.
Because, and they're right. Like we shouldn't be telling them or anyone to suck eggs. I think everyone would be knowledgeable enough to know that an apple is better than a chocolate bar. But how do you get the kid to eat the apple over the chocolate bar? That's what they want to know. And I think that's what every parent wants to know, really. It's not just a grandparent thing. It's a parent thing too.
Because this is a pregnancy podcast, so people will be with really little babies wanting grandparent care. And things have changed quite a bit. Right. We still have people saying, oh, my God, my mum wants to put in a biscuit into the milk so it's fortified and she's cut a hole in the teat of the bottle so the kid can chug it down. Those sort of things are really difficult to manage, I think, from a communication perspective.
Yeah. And certainly as well with the, and this came up in our focus groups, just the marketing and the way that things get portrayed. And so, we know that baby food in particular is sort of got all these health claims on it that make it seem as if it's really healthy. But then when you actually look at the back, there's a lot of sugar in it or hasn't got a lot of natural ingredients. So, and that's something not just that grandparents might fall for, but it's something that parents might fall for too. Or the opposite, grandparents might be used to making their own food and mashing it up because that's what they did in, 30, 40 years ago. And they might, recoil in horror at the fact that you are pulling a chicken and beef mashed potato thing off the store shelf. So it's also being conscious at both the parent and the grandparental level that for babies, what are the health claims and making sure you're not falling for them either.
Yep, exactly. Bring to mind Brene Brown, which is clear is kind. And I really love that as I try to work with that as much as I can in my communication. Clear is kind. And so it's not just that the parent knows all about those nutritional aspects. The grandparent brings wisdom to it as well. And I wonder whether there has to be just that generosity to understand that both the grandparent and the parent have something to offer. And then be clear of what the boundaries are after that.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think that grandparents are deliberately not doing what the parents would like them to do, nor do I think the parents are deliberately feeding their kids junk food to get at the grandparents. Like, I think we're all just doing our best here. And so it's understanding that everyone's come at it from a good place. That doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement for both parties, but we're all just trying our best And let's start from that before we sort of start engaging in conversations.
So we've talked a little bit about resources. You said seminars would be good, and anyone listening, yes, seminars would be great. Are there any other resources that you provide yourself? I think I noticed on your website that there are some. Yeah.
Yeah. So the resources on my website were developed from this research. So, the grandparents who came to the focus groups for the nutrition stuff, they said they wanted hints and tips. So we've got some fact sheets. We've also got some activity cards. So how do you sort of encourage a love of certain foods without necessarily forcing it on them? So we've got a bunch of activity cards, fun science experiments to increase love of vegetables and fruits. We've also got some stuff around physical activity and managing screen time. So the setting limit stuff that I mentioned earlier, there's a tip there for that. But then also just would encourage people to jump onto the Live Lighter website. So there are quite a few resources there. So there's the Live Lighter for families, that sort of have great recipes on there, low-cost recipes. So that tends to be my go-to, the Live Lighter website, plus my own resources, of course. And then if you're looking for if you're more into sort of the research on marketing claims, then the Food for Health Alliance does a lot of work in this space, calling out the industry for, their manipulative practices. So that might be something that people are interested in too.
Oh my God, how fantastic. They're great resources. I'll make sure that we get them into the show notes so people can just go there, click on it, and maybe it might just spark that conversation or have that starting point that parents need to be able to communicate with the grandparents or vice versa. Like a grandparent might pick up this and think, well, how can I communicate better with my child? So, yeah.
That's the hope.
That's the hope. Michelle, this has been a fantastic episode. Thank you so much for your time. I'm really appreciative of you joining us today.
Thank you. I'm excited to see it all online.
Thanks for listening, everyone. That was so good. I brought a lot of my own stuff into that episode because, yes, my mum has been amazing as a grandparent at times and not so amazing at other times, I must admit. It's been a process of continually having to communicate well between her and I to get, a parenting agreement between us as to how she was helping raise our kids. So, yes, I hope you really enjoyed it. I do still want to get to talking to grandparents and parents about what's changed in pregnancy and what those critical points are. They'll be in upcoming episodes. So, look forward to that. I hope you have a really great week and we'll be in your ears next week. Bye for now.